Demonstrations against the death of Mahsa Amini have led to violent police crackdowns in Iran, with arrests and the killing of at least 200 people, although human rights organizations say the number is much higher. There have also been internet outages and disruptions to cut the protesters' communication with the outside world. How dangerous are these protests for the Iranian regime? And where will they lead the nation into? In this video, I will explain what's happening in Iran right now, why the protests are not only about the death of Amini, and why the situation is way more complex than you think. Welcome to Dark New World. The anti-government protests that have erupted in cities across Iran in response to a young woman's death in the custody of the country's morality police have struck a national nerve. The demonstrations have spread to dozens of cities, and multiple casualties have been reported. Iran is in crisis mode. What triggered the protests was the death of a young woman. Mahsa Amini, who also went by the name Gina, was with her family on a visit to Tehran from her home in the northwestern province of Kurdistan when she was arrested on an accusation of violating the hijab law. The law went into effect in 1981, after the Islamic Revolution. It has long been challenged by many women in Iran and is commonly flouted across the country. Amini died 3 days after her detention while in custody of the morality police, who enforce the country's strict Islamic rules. Iran's security forces issued a statement saying that Mrs. Amini had collapsed from a heart attack at the detention center while receiving training on hijab rules. Her family disputed this claim, saying she was perfectly healthy before her arrest, according to news reports. A couple of weeks later, and the country is still in chaos. What started about the protests against the morality police is now growing into a wave of protests against the Iranian regime and their theocratic grip on the country. But the political situation is more complicated than many believe. Amini belonged to the Kurdish minority in Iran. In the west of the country, the minority battles for autonomy rights for almost 80 years. Among Iran's 31 provinces, Kurdistan in the northwest is one of the 3 border regions, along with Khuzestan in the southwest and Sistan and Balochistan in the east, with volatile ethnic issues that have led to protests, strife and calls for autonomy and independence. Stability in Kurdistan is vital to security on the border with Iraq and maintaining territorial integrity. The province is a microcosm of challenges from Iran's many ethnic minorities. Iran and its neighbors have long perceived the Kurds as a threat due to their numbers, geographic distribution and resistance to central authority. The Kurds are the 4th largest ethnic group in the Middle East. The fact that the protests erupted in these Kurdish regions first is no coincidence. The Kurds have long battled the grip of Tehran, which sees the minority as a disturbance. In order to crack down on the protests, the Iranian Air Force bombed Kurdish border towns in Iraq. As the government crisis in Iraq is unfolding, Tehran doesn't have to fear any response from the incapable government in Baghdad and Erbil. And the attacks are meant to be a message, not to the Kurds in Iraq, but the Kurds in their own country. Bombing the neighbor is easier than striking your own people. The Iranian attack left at least 9 people dead and 32 wounded. Tehran has alleged that Kurdish groups have been helping to fuel the demonstrations. Another important aspect that we should consider when talking about the situation in Iran is the fact that many people didn't see their government in a good light in the first place. The fact that a Kurdish woman was targeted helped the protests to gain traction. It remains to be seen if the protests will widen in scale in the coming weeks. But in order to bring change, the help of oil workers, steel workers, or even the military is needed. For now, the scale of the protests didn't reach that point yet. But if one of these groups would really join, the situation could indeed get dangerous for the regime. In that case, we could see an even more aggressive reaction from the government, and subsequently, more deaths. But there are even more reasons why people are protesting in Iran in the past years. Iran has some fundamental problems with its food security. Iran is located in the dry belt of the world, counts among the driest of countries, with an average rainfall of only 250 mm a year. In spite of its nearly 165 million hectares of land, only about 50 million of it are arable, with just 18 million hectares used for farming. As drought and other repercussions of climate change strains Iran agriculture, leading occasionally to unrest, the sector is also struggling with a growing population, decades of unsustainable socio-economic development and mismanagement. Confronting a situation that has steadily deteriorated over the past, Iranian authorities have turned to trans-territorial farming as part of their alternative strategy to achieve food security and buy time for soil and water restoration. Iran announced that its Latin American ally, Venezuela, has offered it 1 million hectares of land for cross-country farming. It was reported that Russia had also offered 100,000 hectares of land, in an indication that Tehran is pursuing its plans in various countries. The idea of cross-country farming surfaced in Iran more than 2 decades ago, but officials started implementing serious measures only in 2016 as part of their strategy to secure food supplies for the country's 85 million population. Tehran, which between 2004 and 2017 celebrated its self-sufficiency in strategic products like wheat and even exported parts of its wheat surplus in 2017, now needs to buy a record 8 million tons of wheat in the current season to make up for shortfalls. High food prices led to the Arab Spring, which destroyed Syria, Libya and many other Arabic countries for decades. The food crisis that the Ukraine conflict is sparking could lead to an implosion of the remaining functioning states in the region. But food insecurity is not the only problem in Iran. There is also water scarcity. Whether in monarchic or revolutionary Iran, the government has not paid ample attention to its existential threat. To the contrary, the Iranian government's policy has been counterproductive in terms of devising a water strategy. The government's mismanagement of the country's water resources will only be amplified by other factors. Global warming and population growth are an added burden on water availability and can cause social disturbances. Today, the country has already witnessed several demonstrations in different Iranian cities in reaction to water scarcity, a trend that will only become more acute and will constitute a formidable challenge to Iran's government and society. Over the past few decades, across a variety of governments in Iran, enough attention has not been paid to water security. For example, the Iranian government under the Shah focused on cultivating agriculture that consumed tremendous amounts of water. The result was the destruction of the Qanat water system that had functioned for millennia and the creation of large burdens on urban centers because of migration. And the situation did not improve much after the revolution. The post-1979 government prioritized maximum extraction rather than curbing the consumption of water. Although the water problem is partially linked to economic sanctions against the country, it is not the main cause, as the Iranian government claims. Iran jostling with the international community after the revolution made it reluctant to rely on other countries for vital crops and instead try to be self-sufficient. The coming weeks and months will show if the protests will erupt into something bigger. But although most Western media outlets would see a revolution as a good change, we have to remind ourselves what happened to Syria. As violent and backwards-oriented the regime is, the alternative can be another regional civil war with millions of deaths. And even if these protests will get shut down, the next crisis, as we just discussed, is already in the making. There is no way around food and water insecurities, and Iran will have to face existential threats in the near future. It doesn't look good for the region, but surprisingly, Europe is on a dark path too. If you want to know how bad the future for the EU looks like, then check out this video. And on the right, we have a video about the wars of the 2020s. My name is Dennis, thank you for watching and goodbye.